Hey, this is Jeff Ferrell coming to you from Texas in the United States. I want to talk a bit today about my book, Crimes of Style, Urban Graffiti and the Politics of Criminality. This book has recently come out as the first volume in the new Criminologia Cultural series in Brazil. I'm honored to be part of that series, really thrilled to be part of the conversation around power and politics and culture and criminology in Brazil. More importantly, perhaps, the book was edited and translated by Salah Khaled. To Salah, all I can say is many, many thanks for all your great work on this book and otherwise. Obrigado, obrigado. Thank you very much. This book, I think the significance of it perhaps is not only one of the first book-length studies of contemporary graffiti, and I'll say something about that, it's also the book that led to the development of cultural criminology. The next book I published after this book was in fact entitled Cultural Criminology, and those understandings grew largely from this case study of graffiti and the response to it. So perhaps I could say a little bit first about the graffiti itself. Again, this book was a in-depth participatory case study into what was then called hip-hop graffiti, now is simply often referred to as graffiti in the United States and Europe, the most prominent form of graffiti associated again originally with the hip-hop movement, with urban culture in the United States, beginning in the 70s and 80s and soon traveling to Europe and South America and elsewhere. The book was titled and is titled in English Crimes of Style, and the reason for this is that as I did this research over a 5-year period, fully involved, becoming myself a member of a graffiti crew, being arrested and spending a year on probation for my participation in the subculture, all but living with the members of my crew for 5 years, night after night, all night forays, drinking, partying, talking, working on art. What I discovered was that indeed these were inherently and essentially crimes of style. The motivation was not monetary gain. In fact, graffiti writers often lost money doing graffiti. It was not vengeance. It was not violence. It was not interpersonal conflict or domestic conflict. The motivation was fame and status derived from style. And every organizing principle in the graffiti underground, the terms used for doing graffiti, terms of approbation or condemnation, terms of praise, graffiti writers' own nicknames and tag names, all were defined by and evaluated by style, by how fresh and original someone's style was, by the way it referenced when it meant to reference popular culture or did not reference popular culture. One's status in the subculture was never in my 5 years judged by gender or by ethnicity or by social class, only by style. So it was an interesting sort of democracy and a sort of aesthetic democracy in which your status as a graffiti writer, your membership and belonging in the subculture, again, was sometimes ruthlessly and very aggressively, but only judged by the style with which you wrote graffiti, designed murals, even the aesthetics of where you place those murals, in what spot, with what surrounding aesthetics, with what kind of view lines, what kind of availability for the public to view it. All of this was the collective motivation for graffiti. And so again, these were crimes not of aggression or anger. These were aesthetic crimes, crimes that were illegal, yes, but were also part of a broader artistic and aesthetic enterprise by these young kids, almost all from impoverished backgrounds, taking to the streets to do graffiti. So in that sense, you can see some of the roots of cultural criminology. We must pay attention to aesthetics as an organizing principle among subcultures and groups. We have to think about perception and about image and representation when we look at both mainstream and groups labeled deviant or criminal. These are the hallmarks of social life and often the most powerful bonds that keep people together and give them a common purpose and a common sense of identity. If we stop there, that would be perhaps an interesting study of a new form of urban art. And again, in the roots of cultural criminology, the way this was organized around representation, meaning, and style. But there was a double issue of style here, which was as I continued to do the research and as I got caught up in the conflict, again, myself arrested and condemned by authorities for my participation, I began to realize there was another aesthetic issue here, which was the aesthetics of those in authority. As it turned out, the mayor, the civic leaders, the corporate business people, they too lived for style and aesthetics, except in their case, it was what I came to call the aesthetics of authority. So it was not simply that graffiti was a crime, it was a crime to be condemned and attacked precisely because it undermined the way in which political authorities and economic leaders wanted the city to look. To them, graffiti interrupted their own aesthetic of clean lines, safe streets, neat lawns and gardens, buildings without any evidence of other interventions other than the builder and the occupier of that private property. So as it turned out, it was indeed a crime of style, but in more than one way. It was a crime defined by style, graffiti that is, but it was also made to be a crime and aggressively attacked precisely because of style on the part of the authorities. They too had a style and an aesthetic that they found threatened by this new form of urban art, by these urban interventions into what they considered their walls, their parks, their green belts, their alleyways. And because of this, there was also, as I found, an hysterical, aggressive campaign against graffiti, a campaign that labeled graffiti as the number one problem in the city, a campaign that led to lengthy jail time and multiple arrests, including my own, for doing what was once not considered much of a crime at all. And here, classic criminological concepts were clearly at play. For example, the authorities and the mass media carefully used moral panic. They deployed moral panic to create panic among the population by linking graffiti to violent assault, to gang takeovers of neighborhoods. In one of the most notorious cases, as I documented in the book, the claim was that graffiti was the equivalent of rape, that to see graffiti on one's wall was the same as being sexually assaulted in an alleyway or a public space. So they very carefully used language. For example, I snuck into meetings and listened to discussions where the agreement was we will never say graffiti artist, we'll only say graffiti vandal. We'll never refer to this as art, only as vandalism. The mayor infamously said, no matter how beautiful it is, all graffiti is ugly. That is, all graffiti is an affront to the city and a danger to the city. And therefore, the attempt to link graffiti to broader forms of social decay, threat, aggression, and violence was not true, simply not true, but was part of the attempt to create moral panic around graffiti. And in terms of Becker's classic notion of moral entrepreneurship, I found there were agencies and up-and-coming politicians and businesses that clearly were trying to sell the moral danger of graffiti because that would in turn enhance their careers, sell their products, promote their political campaigns, this sort of thing. So again, Cohen and Young, moral panic, Becker, moral entrepreneurship, many of the classic notions of how everyday activities become crime were at play in the response to graffiti. And so that, again, we did have a war on graffiti, as I documented, but the war was fought on both sides by style, but only on one side by deploying lies and fabrications and an attempt at moral panic. This was also linked, as it turned out, to the desire, which we've now seen decades later in cities like Denver, to gentrify the inner city, to remove from it homeless people and street musicians and beggars and graffiti writers in the interest of raising property values, building condominiums, selling urban space as a desirable commodity. So even if we look again at the political economy of urban areas, the sort of Marxist approach, which I do not fully engage with Marxism, but if we look at a sort of political economy of the city, we see again that the campaigns against graffiti and the attempts to suppress it were part of a changing political economy. They were part of a change from factory economies to service economies and the desire to revitalize, in the terms of the authorities, the urban areas in the interest of urban development. So again, in terms of the roots of cultural criminology, if we want to look at representation, style, how meaning is negotiated, how images are contested, these are not simply add-ons to the actual issues. These are the actual issues. The nature of power in the contemporary city, the nature of resistance to that power, is almost inevitably defined by and flows through issues of meaning, interpretation, aesthetics, and style. And so once again, in terms of how we developed cultural criminology, this was not a sort of frivolous endeavor to document the work of graffiti writers or the campaigns against it. This was an attempt to deeply penetrate the late modern capitalist economies that drive the world today and to penetrate the battles over space, and meaning. And so to ask who owns the city, whose city is Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro or Fort Worth or Denver or New York, the answer is essentially aesthetic. The answer is who controls perception, who controls the availability of understanding and the meaning that our activities take. And one final point, which if you have a chance to read the book, you'll see, is again, my background is not really Marxist or liberal pluralist, it's anarchist. I am trained in and by nature an anarchist. And anarchists, of course, are especially interested in taking on all forms of power, defying any form of authority that is imposed on others, and finding ways to defy authority that are celebratory and humorous and joyful, not stern and dictatorial. And so as I wrote in the book, it strikes me that while the graffiti writers did not use these terms, they were clearly engaged in anarchist resistance to authority. They understood the role of police and how they harassed kids on the street. They understood how the city wanted to control the inner city areas and wash them out of them. They understood the mayor's ploy to try to use graffiti to get reelected and the moral entrepreneurs who were using graffiti to boost their careers. They were well aware of this and they were intent on fighting back against it through art and style. So again, if we are interested in power, and if as an anarchist or otherwise we're interested in confronting power, we would do well to pay attention to those who innately at a street level have learned how to confront power and who have the defiance and courage and artistic skills to create beauty at the same moment that they are creating resistance to authority. So if you have a chance, I hope you enjoy the book. Again, I'm honored that it is now part of the Brazilian discussion and has been translated into Portuguese. I've had the chance a couple of times to come to Brazil and seeing the remarkable urban graffiti. I'm also honored to have this book and these forms of graffiti interjected into a culture that already is well aware of issues of art, power, and resistance. So again, thank you very much. Obrigado. I'll see you soon.